Chinese woman for sale was slapped during an auction. But then the mountain man stepped in. That's what they whispered in hushed tones outside the saloon, what mothers warned their daughters about, and what old men muttered at the trading post. They said she was slapped like an animal in front of everyone. They said he rose from the shadows like thunder rolling off the mountain. No one knew where he came from. No one knew why he cared. But once he stepped in, everything changed. Who was she? Who was he? And what kind of justice rides in silence? When the past collides with cruelty and a silent man takes a stand, the dust never settles without leaving a mark. Who found mercy that day? And who finally faced the truth? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that these stories reach far beyond the frontier. If values like honor, justice, and quiet strength still matter to you, then you're riding with us. Let me know which state you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and help us keep telling stories that ought never be forgotten. The noon sun hung high over the town of Windermere, blistering the earth beneath cracked boots and carriage wheels. Dust rolled lazy across Main Street as folks gathered near the auction square, some clutching parasols, others wiping sweat from their brows. A wooden platform had been raised outside the old feed store, warped boards creaking under the weight of another day's trade. But today's business was no mule, no cow, no chest of silver ore. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 20. Thin, her wrists tied in front of her with coarse rope, she stood barefoot on the platform with her gaze locked to the ground. Her dark hair, tangled and unwashed, stuck to her face, and her cheek bore the fading bruise of some past handling. She wore a torn linen shift, the color once white but now smeared with dirt and blood. No name was spoken, just a signboard at her feet. Indentured, obedient, strong. Horace Finch stood beside her, a barrel-chested man with a belly that strained the buttons of his dusty vest. He twirled a cigar between yellow teeth, his voice booming across the crowd like a preacher at judgment. $100 for a strong pair of hands, $200 for obedience. Who'll start me off? The crowd shifted. Some looked on in pity, others in hunger, but no one spoke. Not yet. A thin man in a bowler hat finally raised his hand, offering 50. A woman in church dress gasped softly, clutching her Bible tighter. Horace scoffed. 50? For this fine specimen? Look at her bones. She's built for labor. The girl flinched at the word. Still, she said nothing. Her silence was a scream no one heard. The bidding crawled upward. 70, 80, 100. Then Horace slapped her across the face. Open-handed, hard. Her head jerked sideways and a gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. She didn't cry out. She didn't move. Her lip bled. See that? Horace barked, triumphant. Doesn't even flinch. That's the kind of girl you want hauling buckets, working fields. She's trained. The town sheriff leaned against a post nearby, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded. He didn't speak. Neither did the preacher, nor the banker, nor the baker's wife. They'd seen worse, they told themselves. And besides, she wasn't one of theirs. Then it happened. A voice, low, rough like gravel beneath a wagon wheel. Let her go. Heads turned. The crowd parted. He stood at the edge of the square, tall, wide-shouldered, wrapped in a wolfskin duster and shadow. A brimmed hat covered his face, but his beard was gray, his skin weathered like old leather. A rifle was slung across his back. A hunting knife hung from his belt. He looked like a man carved from stone and snow. No one said his name, but everyone knew it. Jonas Cutter. He hadn't set foot in town for years, not since the fire, not since the graves. Horace laughed, sharp and short. What's this? Mountain ghost come to haunt me? Jonas took one slow step forward, eyes locked on the girl. Let her go, he repeated. No one moved. No one breathed. The world held its breath. The sun beat down on cracked earth. And beneath that sun, something ancient stirred. Not in the crowd, not in Horace, not even in Jonas, but in the girl's eyes. A flicker, a question. Could this be real? Could anyone still choose right over power? No one knew then, but the dust had shifted. And nothing in Windmere would ever be the same again. The day baked beneath a merciless sun, the kind that made horses shiver at flies and men's tempers short. Windmere simmered in silence, broken only by the rustle of skirts and the creak of harness leather. Main Street stood still, every window half-shuttered, every door open just a crack, just wide enough for watching eyes. Folks lined the edges of the dusty square like cattle come to gawk, their gazes fixed on the crude wooden platform nailed together outside the feed store. It was auction day, but this was no common trade. There was no barrel of pickled beans or busted saddle to go home with today. This was a person. Two deputies dragged her by the arms, their grip too tight, their indifference worse than cruelty. She stumbled as they pulled her forward, wrists tied with twine that cut into her skin. She didn't cry out. Her name was Malin, but no one called her that. No one asked. Her clothes were simple, a faded linen shift cinched at the waist with a rope, her bare feet cracked and caked in road dust. Her hair hung like a curtain over her face, hiding the bruises blooming beneath her right eye. Her body trembled, but her chin stayed level. She had learned not to look up, not to make herself seen, not to give them anything they could take. Horace Finch stepped onto the platform beside her, arms wide like a showman at the circus. His vest was stretched tight over his gut, the silver buttons straining like they feared the light. A gold chain dangled from his pocket, and his mustache twitched as he smiled. The kind of smile a man wears when he thinks the world belongs to him. "Folks," he barked, turning in a slow circle to face the onlookers, "what we have here is a rare opportunity, a healthy, obedient, contract-bound servant direct from the port of San Francisco. Speaks a little English, works sunup to sundown, and don't give no lip." He placed a heavy hand on Maylene's shoulder. She didn't flinch. Not yet. "Starting at $100, he said. You won't find a better bargain in the territories." A few men grunted. One leaned over to whisper to another. A farmer from the north held up two fingers. Horace frowned. 200, came another voice. A merchant from the general store, sweat dripping off his chin. Malin's heart thudded in her ears, but her eyes stayed low. 250, came the next bid, louder, surer. Horace grinned. He turned back toward Malin and squeezed her shoulder hard. "Show 'em what they're buying." When she didn't move, he backhanded her across the face with such force her knees buckled. The crack of the slap echoed down the street. Blood sprang from her lip. A woman in the crowd gasped. A man muttered, "That weren't necessary," but no one stepped forward. Not the preacher, standing solemn with hands clasped. Not the sheriff, tipping his hat low to avoid the scene. Not the women clutching parasols and looking away. No one. Malin slowly straightened. Her breath was ragged, but her eyes lifted just slightly. For a moment, only a flicker. That's when the voice came. "Let her go." It wasn't loud, but it cut through the heat like thunder through still air. Heads turned, faces searching, and there he stood on the edge of the gathering, tall, weathered, wrapped in a long coat and silence. Jonas Cutter, the mountain man. He hadn't been seen in Windmere in 6 years, but everyone remembered him. Horace blinked, confused. "What was that?" he barked. Jonas took a step forward. "I said, let her go." A hush fell over the crowd, thick and weighty. The air itself seemed to tighten, holding its breath for what would come next. The kind of moment folks would talk about years later, when legends formed out of silence and dust. Jonas Cutter stood like a stone pillar on the edge of the auction square, one boot planted firm in the dust, the other just barely rocking back on his heel. A hush had fallen so complete that even the flies hovering near the livestock pen seemed to vanish from the air. The townsfolk turned to look, one by one, as if the very land itself had drawn their attention. There he was, the mountain man, weather-beaten, broad-shouldered, his grizzled beard reaching nearly to his chest, and the tail of a wolf pelt draped over his shoulder, brushing against a long, sun-faded duster. He looked like he'd stepped out of a ghost story or a legend too old to forget. Children had grown up hearing his name in warnings. Jonas Cutter, the man who buried his family with his bare hands and never came down from the hills again. Women whispered about the day he walked out of the church before his daughter's funeral was done. Drunken men at the saloon muttered that he'd once killed 4 claimed jumpers with nothing but a rusted spade. Some said he talked to wolves. Some said he was one. And yet he stood here now, not as a myth, but as a man, real and breathing, eyes like iron locked on the girl. I said, "Let her go." This time the words rang louder, deeper. Horace Finch blinked as if slapped himself. He tilted his head, trying to read the situation, the way a wolf tests a fence. He laughed once, nervous. "You got business here, Cutter. Ain't seen you in town since—" Jonas didn't answer, didn't move, just stared. Horace shifted his weight. "You ain't got no claim. She's already bought and sold fair. Contract signed. Nothing to do with you." The sheriff, leaning against the jailhouse post, finally stood upright. His hand brushed the butt of his pistol, but he didn't draw. Jonas's reputation, it seemed, carried more weight than the tin star on his chest. The preacher stiffened, glancing from Jonas to Horace, uncertain which devil deserved his prayers. Jonas's eyes never left Meline. She stood still on the platform, cheek bleeding, one strand of hair plastered across her face. Her breath hitched. Her knees threatened to buckle again. But she looked at him, really looked at him. This man was no lawman, no preacher, no kin. And yet he stood for her, a stranger, a shadow, a relic pulled from the mountain. "What's it to you?" Horace asked, louder now, puffing his chest. "You come down to play hero, Cutter? This ain't your fight." Jonas stepped forward once, then again, each step deliberate, like the earth might shatter if he moved too fast. When he reached the edge of the platform, he spoke again, low, unshaking. "It is now." Horace scoffed. "You crazy old fool. Think you can scare me with those bear skins and dead man eyes?" But even as he said it, his voice cracked. His hand twitched at his hip, but he didn't reach for the pistol. Not yet. Meline's gaze flicked between them, this brutal man who had struck her, and the one who stood like a fortress carved from the mountain itself. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she felt the faintest ember of something she thought she'd lost, the possibility of choice. The crowd held its breath. The wind stilled. The sun beat down, relentless and silent. And in that moment, Jonas Cutter stood not just between her and Horace, but between the world she'd known and something she hadn't dared to dream. Something like safety, something like hope. The tension broke with a sharp intake of breath from the crowd as Horace's hand flew to his holster. His face twisted into something cruel, something proud and desperate all at once. "You don't tell me what to do," he snarled, pulling iron from his hip with the speed of a man used to making others flinch. But Jonas Cutter was already moving. There was no hesitation in his step, no tremor in his hand. Before the pistol cleared its leather, Jonas's hunting knife had left his grip. The crowd saw it, just a blur of steel arcing through the heat-shimmered air, before it sank into the wooden platform with a solid, final thud. It buried itself just an inch from Horace's hand, close enough to feel the wind of its passing, close enough to stop him cold. Horace froze mid-draw, sweat popping on his brow. He looked down at the blade, at the way it vibrated in the wood as if still hungry. and then up at Jonas, who hadn't blinked. The sheriff shouted something. The preacher stumbled backward, bumping into a woman clutching her bonnet. Children screamed. A baby wailed. But Jonas didn't raise another weapon. He didn't draw the rifle across his back. He simply walked forward, the silence closing in around him like a second skin. Mylene stood barely upright, her body trembling, blood trailing from the corner of her mouth. Jonas reached the platform and stepped up with a strength that made the planks groan beneath his boots. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. He just looked at her, really looked, and then lifted her into his arms with a gentleness that didn't seem possible from a man wrapped in wolfskin and silence. She didn't struggle. She couldn't. But even if she had the strength, something told her she wouldn't have. His arms were steady, his grip firm. She felt the heat of his chest, the rough scratch of his beard against her forehead. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she might disappear. Jonas Cutter turned, descended the steps, and walked straight through the parting crowd. No one tried to stop him, not the sheriff, whose fingers hovered near his badge but never touched it. Not Horace, who stared at the blade still trembling in the platform as if it had told him a secret he couldn't bear to hear. A little boy whispered, "Is she dead?" His mother shook her head, tears in her eyes. "No, baby. She's been taken." Another voice said, "He kidnapped her." Someone else muttered, "No, he saved her." But no one knew for sure. Jonas Cutter disappeared down the trail leading out of Windmere, his boots kicking up dust. Mylene held close like something precious, like something not meant to be caged. He never looked back, and as the dust settled behind him, the town stood silent, stunned, not knowing if they had just witnessed an abduction or the beginning of a legend. The cabin stood alone beneath the pines, hidden where the tree line kissed the mountain's flank, and the creek ran swift and cold over black stone. Moss clung to the corners of the roof. The shutters were wooden, thick, and worn by wind. The smoke from the chimney rose in a steady line, curling into the dusky sky like the breath of something old and watching. No one came here unless they were lost or had nothing left to lose. Jonas pushed the door open with his boot and stepped inside. The air smelled of cedar and old leather. The place was Spartan, one cot, one chair, a stone hearth, and a workbench cluttered with half-carved wood. A rifle rested against the far wall. Lanterns hung from hooks in the beams, casting soft golden circles across the floor. There were no decorations, no tokens of joy. Just utility. A space to survive, not to live. He laid Mylene down on the cot with a care that didn't match the size of his hands. She didn't speak. Her eyes flitted around the room, tracking exits, corners, weapons. She flinched when he reached for a basin, her breath catching like a trap had been sprung. Jonas paused, not because he was surprised, but because he understood. He fetched warm water from the hearth, clean cloth, and a tin of old salve. He didn't touch her right away. He sat on the edge of the cot and looked at her face, as if asking permission without words. She nodded barely, then turned her face away. He cleaned the blood from her lip, dabbed the bruise on her cheek, and said nothing. His hands were steady, slow, like a man fixing something precious he didn't know how to name. When he finished, he stood and poured a cup of water from a clay jug, set it beside her on a stump table, and left a plate with a thick slice of bread and some strips of smoked meat. Then he stepped outside. The door clicked softly behind him. Malin lay there in the quiet, staring at the beams overhead. The cot smelled like pine and ash. Her lip throbbed. Her wrist burned from the rope. But the room was warm. The blankets were clean. The food was untouched, but it didn't smell of rot. Outside, Jonas sat on a stool beneath a crooked lantern, his knife in hand, a block of wood cradled in his palm. The steady rhythm of carving began. Soft, scraping strokes, each one patient, measured. His eyes stayed on the wood. The forest sang around him, wind in the trees, the rush of the creek, an owl's distant cry. Inside, Melan closed her eyes. She didn't trust him. Not yet. She didn't know why he'd taken her, what he wanted, or how long this would last. But he hadn't locked the door. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't touched her more than was needed to clean her wounds. And outside, the mountain man carved something slowly beneath the stars. A silence grew between them, not cold, but quiet, not empty, but waiting. A silence that did not demand anything. A silence that, somehow, felt like the first kindness she'd known in a long, long time. The mountain air shifted with the season, warm winds dipping low through the trees, brushing against pine needles and whispering through the cabin chinks like a song half remembered. Days passed, not hurriedly, but with the slow gait of an old mule, steady, unspoken, necessary. Maylene no longer flinched when Jonas moved near. She didn't speak, not at first, but she watched him from the doorway with quiet eyes as he worked, her fingers wrapped around a mug of bitter tea brewed from dried herbs she couldn't name. Jonas rose early, before the light cracked the sky. He'd stomp the dirt from his boots at the door, then knock, always knock, before entering. If she was awake, he'd nod. If she was asleep, he'd wait until the kettle whistled before making noise. He moved with the caution of a man who remembered how it felt to lose something delicate. Malin began sweeping the floor one morning without being asked. The broom leaned useless in the corner for days until she picked it up and started pushing dust and pine needles into neat little piles. Jonas didn't say a word. Just watched from the edge of the porch before turning back to his traps. She boiled water in the mornings now, crushed herbs with the back of a spoon, made something warm and bitter that soothed the throat, and left it waiting for him beside the door. He drank it. Every drop. She followed him sometimes from a distance, watched him split wood, bare arms swinging the axe with the ease of years. He worked like a man who knew pain and had decided to keep his hands busy to outrun it. Other days he repaired snares along narrow game trails or fed the mule tethered beside the shed. He never raised his voice, never made demands. When he needed to speak, he used only the words required, clipped and plain. Melan found a box beneath the cot one afternoon. Inside, scraps of canvas, squares of leather, odds and ends from traps long rusted, and charcoal, old, hard, but still usable. Her fingers hesitated, hovering above the lump of black until her breath steadied. That night, while Jonas sat by the fire carving some unknown shape, Maylene crouched near the wall and began to draw. Her hands moved like they remembered something her heart had forgotten. Gentle curves became wings. Sharp strokes formed beaks. A kestrel in flight, a sparrow at rest, a hawk with eyes that looked like her own. Jonas noticed. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question. When she finally stepped away from the wall, fingers stained with soot, he looked at the birds and gave a single nod. Nothing more. But it was enough. In that cabin, a rhythm settled like dust after a long storm. No promises, no grand gestures, just two broken lives learning how to exist in the same quiet. The space between them began to soften, not through words but through presence, through tea left steaming, through carved wood exchanged for drawn wings, through silence that no longer hurt. The mountain, once a place of exile, began to feel like a refuge. The trees no longer loomed. The creek's voice became a lullaby. And the old pain, still present, still sharp, found room to breathe beside the fragile beginnings of trust. The sun had dipped behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the trees that whispered with wind and memory. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked low, painting the walls in shifting gold. Jonas had gone outside after supper, his quiet presence fading into the trees the way it often did when night crept in. Maylene remained inside, her hands resting in her lap, eyes drawn toward the far corner she'd never paid much mind to before. There was a bundle there, tucked beneath a dusty wool blanket, hidden like something someone couldn't quite bring themselves to part with. The rest of the cabin was practical, stripped of sentiment, but this bundle called to her, fragile and still. She rose slowly, stepping over the soft creak of the floorboards and knelt before it. Her fingers hesitated, then pulled the blanket back. What lay beneath was carved from dark walnut wood, polished smooth in some places, left rough in others. A cradle, small, handcrafted. The spindles at the sides were shaped like tree trunks, and etched into the headboard were the initials. E.C. Milene's breath caught. She reached out and touched the letters with trembling fingers, tracing them slowly. The wood was cold, still, but it held something, something unspoken and heavy. Behind her the door groaned softly on its hinges. She didn't turn. Didn't have to. She felt Jonas's presence before he stepped fully inside. His boots thudded once, then paused. Silence stretched between them like a wire strung tight across years. "I made it for my daughter," he said at last. His voice sounded different, thicker, pulled from somewhere buried deep. "Her name was Eleanor." Milene turned her head slightly, not speaking, not pushing. "She got sick," he said. "Or maybe it was the fire. Maybe both. I don't remember the order. Just one day she was in my arms, and the next there was only smoke." He stepped closer, but his eyes weren't on the cradle. They were fixed somewhere far away, as if staring through the walls. "My wife, she followed, grief or guilt. I couldn't stop it." Maylene rose slowly, her hands still resting on the cradle's edge. She looked at him, her voice quiet but clear. "Nothing left worth saving," he had said. "But you still saved me," she whispered. Jonas didn't answer. His jaw clenched. His eyes shone, but didn't fall. He turned away without a word, stepping back into the night. Later, after the fire had dimmed and Milene lay curled in the cot, she heard the soft scrape of wood across the floor. She opened her eyes just enough to see Jonas carrying the cradle from the corner and setting it gently beside the hearth. He stood over it for a long while. Then he sat in the chair beside it, silent, unmoving, watching the flames dance across the curved wood he once carved with hope. Outside, the wind rose through the trees, but the mountain did not feel so cold. Inside the cabin, grief breathed alongside healing. The past had not left, but it had stepped forward. A cradle once hidden now stood where it belonged, in the light. In the shadowed corners of Windmere, where the alley behind the saloon met the trail leading west, Horace Finch spat blood into the dirt and nursed a bruised pride more painful than any wound. The memory of Jonas Cutter's voice, calm, firm, final, rang in his ears like a bell that wouldn't stop tolling. The knife had missed his hand by inches, but it may as well have buried itself in his chest. The silence of the townsfolk afterward, the way no one came to his defense, had cut deeper than steel. He saddled his horse before dawn, rage thick in his throat. Dust flew behind him as he rode hard to the edge of the county line, past the station yard where the rail tracks bent like spines across the prairie. He knew where to go, knew who to see. The office of the Central Pacific Authority squatted near the rail yard like a judge's bench, square-jawed and gray. Inside, Wallace Dane sat behind a heavy oak desk, ledger open, spectacles perched low on his nose. His face was smooth and pale, untouched by sun or sorrow. His hands, though soft, gripped the pen like it was a weapon. Horace slammed the door open without knocking. "She's gone." Wallace didn't look up. "Which one?" "The girl from the boat. The one I bought legal. The China woman." Wallace flipped through the ledger with practiced fingers. "Ah, lot 7, marked under indenture. 2 years unpaid." "She was taken," Horace growled, "by Jonas Cutter." That made Wallace pause. He set the pen down and looked up slowly. The mountain man, Horace nodded, stormed into town like the devil himself, stole her right out of my hands, threatened me in front of half the county. Wallace closed the ledger. She's company property. She's my property. Wallace didn't correct him. Instead, he rose and walked to a tall cabinet, unlocking it with a brass key pulled from his vest. Inside were papers, sealed envelopes, a shotgun. He withdrew two items, a federal indenture contract, signed, stamped, and brittle, and a thin badge with the company's insignia. "We'll do this clean," Wallace said. "Legal." Within the hour, a party of four rode out. Wallace, Horace, and two men from the rail yard known more for fists than freight. Each carried iron. Wallace wore his badge pinned to his coat, as if the star granted him righteousness. They called it law, but the heat in Horace's eyes, the smirk on the railmen's faces, it wasn't justice they carried, it was vengeance. The climb began just past the cedar grove, where the trees grew dense and the trail narrowed. The air thinned. The birds went silent. Wallace consulted a hand-drawn map. "Cabin should be north of the bend, near the high creek." Horace grunted, shifting in the saddle. "He won't give her up." "He doesn't have to," Wallace replied. "He just has to make a mistake." The men pressed on, boots heavy, rifles loaded. Behind them, the town of Windermere exhaled slowly, unaware that its silence would soon be broken again. Not by thunder, but by the footsteps of men who mistook possession for justice and law for permission to do harm. The valley opened wide beneath the saddle line, a quiet bowl of green nestled between two wooded ridges. The trail, worn by years of mule hooves and supply wagons, split before the creek bend, one branch winding up into the pines toward Cutter's land, the other leading to a low stone house half hidden beneath wild wisteria. The chimney puffed a thin line of smoke, and herbs hung drying from the porch rafters like flags of a different country, one ruled by medicine, memory, and things unspoken. Wallace reined in his horse first, raising a hand. Horace looked up from beneath his sweat-stained hat. "What now?" he muttered. Wallace pointed with his chin. "That's her place." The two railmen behind them exchanged glances. They'd heard of her. Everyone had. Sister May, midwife, bone setter, healer of mothers, whisperer to the dying. Some said she was half Comanche. Others said she delivered every child in Windermere over the last 40 years and buried most of their fathers. Blind in one eye, sharp in the other. If there was wisdom in the valley, it wore her face. Wallace dismounted. "Won't take long." He walked up the path, boots crunching over dry leaves, and knocked once on the frame with the back of his knuckle. Inside, a chair scraped. A latch lifted. The door creaked open. Sister May stood there wrapped in a shawl, the color of rusted iron, her white braid trailing over one shoulder. One eye milky, the other sharp as glass. Her gaze scanned the men behind him without moving her head. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. Wallace dipped his head politely. "Ma'am?" She answered with silence, stepping back to let him enter. Horace stayed near his horse, arms crossed. "What's he want with an old crone like her?" he grunted. Inside, Wallace stood before her shelves of glass jars and bone-handled tools. "We're headed up to Jonas Cutter's cabin," he said plainly. Her one good eye didn't blink. "I figured. He's harboring a girl, stolen property, belongs to the company. We've got papers." May turned to stir a pot of something thick and fragrant. She didn't speak until the spoon clinked against the rim. "That girl don't belong to anyone," she said. Wallace bristled. "She's indentured, under federal contract." "She's human," May said, turning to face him full. "And Cutter's more man than anyone else in this valley, contract or not. He's a threat." "He's broken," she replied, voice soft but firm. "But not dangerous. Not unless you try to take something that don't belong to you." Wallace narrowed his eyes. Are you warning me? I'm telling you, she said, pointing a crooked finger toward the trail beyond the creek. That man lives in a kind of pain no badge can reach. And that girl's not some ledger mark to be erased. She's the first thing that stirred light in him since the world took everything else. You go up that trail, you best bring more than rifles. Bring truth. Wallace said nothing, just turned on his heel and walked out, the scent of herbs and smoke clinging to his coat. Horace chuckled when he mounted. Did she give you her blessing? Wallace swung into the saddle. She gave us a sermon. They rode on, the trail narrowing, the pines thickening, and behind them, Sister May watched from the porch, one eye gone to cloud, the other sharp enough to see what the men could not. The wind picked up as they disappeared into the trees, carrying her final words behind them like a warning tied to a prayer. The sun had not yet cleared the tree line when the posse reached the ridge above the cabin. Mist clung to the needles of the pines like old breath, and the air was thick with the damp scent of bark and earth. Below them, smoke curled from the chimney of Jonas Cutter's home, steady and undisturbed. The clearing lay quiet, the creek murmuring in the distance like a lullaby holding back the thunder that rode on hoofbeats and steel. Wallace Dane signaled for silence. He dismounted, smoothed the folds of his coat, and checked the paper tucked in his inner pocket. Behind him, Horace cracked his knuckles and nodded to the two railmen, who dismounted in turn, each one patting the rifles slung across their backs. They walked forward as a line, boots sinking into the loamy path, toward the edge of the man's world. Jonas Cutter was already waiting. He stood in front of the cabin with his feet planted shoulder-width apart, arms crossed over his chest, rifle slung across his back. The morning light caught on the gray of his beard, the hard line of his jaw. He didn't speak, didn't move. From behind the door, Mylene watched. One hand rested against the frame, her breath tight in her chest. Her eyes scanned the trees, the men, the paper Wallace held. Wallace stepped forward, adjusting his badge for all to see. Mr. Cutter, he called, voice smooth and practiced, you are harboring a contracted laborer belonging to the Central Pacific Authority. We are here to reclaim her under Article 12 of the Federal Indenture Act. Jonas's face didn't twitch. He didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he turned slightly toward the door and spoke with a voice that held no force, no command, just clarity. You go with them, he said, or you stay. A breath passed. Mylene stepped out into the open, her bare feet silent on the wooden porch. She trembled, but her chin was lifted. She moved to stand beside him, her hand brushing his sleeve. I stay, she said. That was when the shouting started. Horace took a step forward. She don't get to decide that, he bellowed. She's property. The railmen raised their rifles. Jonas didn't flinch. His own weapon stayed strapped across his back, untouched. The air was thick with the sharp scent of pine sap and gun oil, and then came the sound of hooves, a slow, stubborn rhythm clattering up the trail. All eyes turned. Sister May appeared, hunched atop her mule, one hand raised, the other clutching a folded, weather-stained piece of paper. I wouldn't pull a trigger if I were you, she called, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Unless you plan on defending a lie. Wallace frowned. You've made your opinions clear, madam. This ain't opinion, she snapped, tossing the document toward his boots. It's proof. He picked it up, unrolling it slowly. The ink had faded, but the name at the top was still visible. Lee Yun, not Mylene. A dead girl's contract, reused, repurposed, forged for convenience. Wallace's jaw tightened. This paper binds a ghost, Sister May said, and ghosts don't pay debts. The men looked to Wallace. Wallace said nothing. The law, thin, brittle, written in ink and greed, had started to unravel beneath the weight of truth spoken out loud. Jonas stood like a mountain behind Malin, and in the silence that followed, the guns began to lower. Not because permission was granted, but because the fight had shifted. This was no longer about property. This was about a lie carried too far, and a man too rooted to move. The morning after the confrontation, the sky hung low with a soft gray light, and the scent of wet earth lingered in the cabin's corners. Jonas had returned to his work without speaking much, as he always did, chopping wood behind the cabin and checking the traps along the ridgeline. Maylene remained inside, sweeping ash from the hearth and sorting kindling by the firebox. She moved slowly, not from weariness, but from the weight of something pressing in the silence, a feeling that something hadn't yet surfaced, like a shadow just beneath the water's edge. The firewood bin near the door was nearly empty, and she knelt beside it to gather the last of the dry pieces. As she reached deep into the bottom corner, her fingers brushed against something brittle, not wood. She pulled it free and uncurled it carefully. A letter, yellowed and burned along one edge. The characters on the paper were faded but still legible. Chinese, her mother tongue. She hadn't seen her language in weeks, hadn't spoken it in longer. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and her breath caught in her throat. She read it aloud in a whisper, her voice trembling. My name is Lee Yun. I am 17. I came on the sea ship to find work in California. They said I would sew garments, send money home. A man named Wallace Dane met us at the dock. He wore a badge and spoke with gentle words. He said we were lucky. He lied. The edges of the page crumbled slightly in her hands. The next lines were smeared, but she could make out the heart of it. Leon had been taken to a rail camp, kept under guard, sold from man to man in the name of debt. She had tried to escape once and had been punished. She spoke of others, girls with names like Mei and Xu and Ling. Names Maylin recognized not from knowing them, but because she had seen their absence in the eyes of others. The letter ended mid-sentence, burned away, but the last legible line was enough to hollow the air around her. If this is found, please tell someone. Tell them I was real. Maylin sat still for a long time, the letter clutched in her lap. The fire crackled quietly beside her, casting a golden glow on the paper, as if daring her to throw it in, to forget it ever existed. But she didn't. That afternoon, she walked into Windmere with the letter folded in both hands. The townsfolk gathered slowly, as they always did, drawn by curiosity and the subtle tremble in the air that said something important was about to happen. She stood in front of the mercantile, beside the same platform where she'd been sold days before. She unfolded the paper and read it aloud, every word she could salvage. At first, there was only silence, then murmurs. A woman from the saloon pressed a hand to her mouth. A man who'd once bid on Maylane lowered his eyes. The preacher took off his hat. The name Wallace Dane echoed through the crowd like a cracked bell, no longer carrying authority, just shame. They hadn't seen the chains, but now they heard them. In ink, in a girl's final words, in the fire that hadn't finished the job. Truth, once hidden in the bottom of a wood bin, had climbed out and stood in the open. And the people of Windmere, whether ready or not, had heard it. The letter lingered in the preacher's hand long after Milan finished reading it. The paper, thin as moth's wing and browned by flame, trembled just slightly in his grasp, as if it still held the breath of the girl who wrote it. Around him, the townsfolk stood quiet, some shamed, others stunned, a few angry and not sure at whom. The wind picked up the corner of the paper like it wanted to carry the truth further. The sheriff leaned against the hitching post, jaw tight, eyes narrowed not in suspicion anymore, but in something closer to reckoning. His hand rested on the contract Wallace had waved just a day prior, now visibly worn, its fraudulent ink exposed by Sister May's warning and Li Yun's voice. He looked at the two documents, the one legal but empty, the other burned but honest, and for once the badge on his chest didn't feel like enough. He cleared his throat. "We need a town meeting," he said, loud enough for all to hear. The preacher nodded solemnly and stepped forward. placing one steady hand on Melin's shoulder. Tonight, in the saloon if it's offered, we speak on what's been done and what we've allowed to be done. Old Tom, the saloon keeper, who'd spent years serving drinks to men like Horace Finch, raised his hand from the back of the crowd. Doors will be open, chairs will be out, and no whiskey sold till the speaking's done. His voice didn't shake. Neither did his eyes. The crowd began to shift, murmuring to one another with words not of gossip, but purpose. Then came Sister May, riding slow into the square on her gray mule, as if summoned by the very air. She dismounted with the help of a farm boy and stood tall despite the years. Her one good eye scanned the faces in the gathering. "I told you once that ghosts walk among us," she said. Well, one of them spoke today. A girl who never made it home. A girl they tried to erase. She turned slow and deliberate. And if we let evil buy our silence, we are no better than the men who trade in flesh. A woman from the dressmaker's shop stepped forward, nodding. She's right. A farmer followed, removing his hat. I got daughters. That could have been one of mine. Then a dozen more voices rose. Men, women, old, young, until the town square was alive with something Windermere hadn't known in a long while. Conscience. The sheriff looked down at the forged contract one last time, then folded it slowly and tucked it into his coat, not to protect it, but to bury it. Evidence now, not law. The preacher raised his hands. Come sundown, we gather, not to gossip, not to accuse, but to tell the truth aloud and let the chips fall where they may. Melin stood still in the center of it all, her hands clasped tight in front of her, her eyes wide with something she hadn't dared to feel since she was torn from her home across the ocean. Hope. The town was shifting, timidly, imperfectly, but it was turning. And justice, once a word buried beneath contracts and coins, was beginning to rise. The old church house creaked with bodies pressed into pews, the air heavy with dust and breath, and something older than both. Sunlight spilled through the high windows in broken lines, catching on floating motes and the bent heads of those who had come to hear, to judge, or to bear witness. It had been years since the place was this full, not since the last flood or the fire that took the livery. But tonight was different. Tonight the town had gathered to look its own reflection in the eye. At the front of the room stood the makeshift bench, a borrowed table draped in a linen cloth, behind which sat Judge Edmund Shaw, a man known more for his fair handwriting than his spine. To his left, the sheriff. To his right, the preacher. Their faces were solemn, unreadable. There was no jury, just the town. Jonas stood beside Melin, his hands folded in front of him, rifle left outside but not far. He didn't speak. He hadn't since they entered. He didn't need to. His presence spoke louder than words, the kind of presence that bends a room toward silence. Melin stood straight, though her hands trembled. She wore a plain shawl over her shoulders and the same steady expression she had the day she stepped off the block. The town had come to see her, but she refused to shrink under their gaze. Across from them, Wallace Dane stood with his coat buttoned tight and his lips pulled into a sneer of control. He held papers, dozens of them, contracts, ledgers, permits, seals, the tools of a man who believed legality was the same as truth. These accusations, he said, voice sharp and practiced, are nothing more than misplaced emotion. This girl was bound under lawful indenture, transported, assigned, and sold according to code. What she suffered, if anything, occurred under another man's care. My records are clear. My books are open. He turned, held up the contract again. And this so-called proof has no standing. It's unsigned. It's hearsay written in a language most of you can't even read. Are we really going to condemn a man over charcoal and sob stories? A murmur rippled through the room. That's when the boy stood up, small, 12 maybe, brown hair, face too thin, boots scuffed to the sole. He stepped into the aisle with uncertain feet, but his voice, when it came, was clear. "I saw him hit her," the boy said. "My pa, Horace Finch. I was there. He called her a dog, said she'd be easier to train once she learned not to flinch." The crowd hushed. "I seen him take others too," the boy went on. "Girls from the rail station. Said they'd gone north, but they never came back. He had a ledger with names. I saw him tear a page out once. Burned it." Wallace paled. The preacher bowed his head. Judge Shaw raised his hand and slammed it once against the table. "Enough!" The room exploded. Some shouting, some crying, some simply stunned. The sheriff stepped between Wallace and the aisle, hand near his revolver. Jonas didn't move. Meelan closed her eyes. The law had always spoken with paper, but now a child's voice, trembling, honest, untouched by fear, had cut through ink and coin alike. And in that church house, for the first time, the town heard it. The truth, not printed, not paid, just spoken, and they could not unhear it. The church house still echoed with the weight of the boy's testimony when Judge Shaw stood, his old bones creaking as if the very act of rising cost him something. The crowd had hushed again, the storm of voices fading into breathless waiting. Wallace Dane stood pale and rigid, the papers in his hand no longer armor, but dead weight. His mouth opened, ready to spit another line of defense, but the sheriff stepped forward before a word could be loosed. "You're under arrest," the sheriff said, voice steady but quiet. Not triumphant, not cruel, just final. Wallace blinked, confusion flickering across his face. He looked at the judge, at the sheriff, at the townsfolk who had once stepped aside for his boots and nodded at his badge. None of them moved now. None of them saved him. The sheriff cuffed him there in front of all, turned him around, and led him out into the sunlight like any other criminal. Outside, the church bell didn't ring, but it might as well have. Justice, slow and uncertain, had arrived all the same. Horace Finch was not there to see it. He had slipped out before the boy finished speaking, slinking into the shadows like a cornered rat. But Windmere was no longer the place it had been. The trail of his passing was easy to find. Hoof prints leading west, dust unsettled, a bedroll missing from the saloon stables. He ran, but not far. 2 days later, he was found. Jonas Cutter brought him in before dawn, a rope tied loose around his hands, blood crusted at his temple, his lips split. He wasn't beaten bad, just enough to show the struggle. Jonas had tracked him to the canyon, just past the snake turn, where the rocks narrowed and sound echoed sharp. They didn't speak much, just enough for Horace to know that Jonas hadn't forgotten what he'd seen that day on the platform. When Jonas led the horse down Main Street, Horace slumped in the saddle, shame heavier than the bruises. No one cheered. No one spat. They just watched, witnessed, and that was worse. By noon, the judge had handed down the ruling, guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful enslavement under federal code. Wallace Dane was taken to the county seat in irons. Horace was sentenced to labor under guard, rebuilding the same rail lines he'd once used to ship Payne north and west. The irony sat thick in the air. Then came the contracts, stacked like tombstones in the center of town. Some crisp, others stained, all signed under false promises. The preacher lit the match. Sister May dropped the first page into the barrel. Flames caught quick, devouring ink and lies alike. One by one, the townsfolk came forward, tossing their own silence into the fire. The company's hold on Windmere cracked that day. Men tore down signs from the rail yard office. Women opened their homes to the girls still recovering in the hills. The sheriff resigned quietly a week later, replaced by a woman with eyes like steel and no patience for shadows. The town that once looked away now looked inward and forward. The chains weren't just metal or paper. They were fear, habit, apathy, and they were broken now. Meline stood in the square, watching the ashes rise. Jonas stood beside her, silent. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't need to. The town had spoken, and the evil that once wore a badge and a grin now lay bare in the light. The thaw came early that year, like the mountain itself was eager to start again. Snow pulled back from the pines in slow retreat, and the creek, once frozen in silence, rushed loud and clear through the clearing. Birds returned to the trees with cautious song, testing the morning light. In the clearing above the town, the cabin stood as it always had, sturdy, weather-worn, practical. But something was different now, not in the walls or the roof, in the air, in the rhythm of its quiet days. Jonas and Maylene worked side by side, not speaking much, not needing to. They turned soil near the porch, carving long rows with their hands and an old iron spade Jonas hadn't touched in years. The earth was stubborn at first, cold and clumped, but it yielded. Little by little, it broke open. Meline knelt barefoot in the dirt, planting seeds carefully. Beans, tomatoes, wildflowers she didn't know the name of, but liked for their color. She'd found a tin of seeds in a drawer months ago and saved them for a day that didn't feel like morning. That day had finally come. Jonas built a low fence around the garden, one slat at a time, muttering to himself about deer and rabbits, though there was no anger in it, just habit. He moved slower now, not from age but from thoughtfulness, every nail hammered with a kind of care that said this mattered. This small piece of land, these few green shoots, it mattered. Inside, the cabin had changed too. Malin had cleaned the windows and hung bundles of dried sage over the door. The cradle, once tucked beneath a blanket, now sat beside the hearth again, polished and mended, its wood smooth as riverstone. A new blanket had been sewn for it, stitched with quiet hands and steady patience. Jonas had started carving again, not weapons or tools, but toys. A birdhouse now hung from a low pine near the creek, painted blue with red trim, its perch shaped like a feather. Meline had smiled when she saw it. "For what bird?" she asked softly. "Any that wants shelter," Jonas answered. She'd gone back to painting too. The canvas scraps were few, but she made do. Birds mostly, the ones that came back after winter, but also faces, her own, softened and whole. Jonas's caught in profile, eyes turned to the trees. One, still unfinished, showed a small girl holding a wildflower in both hands. And one day in early spring, that girl came. Her name was Clara. 8 years old, orphaned by fever, left with a cousin who didn't want her. The preacher had asked Meline if she might take her in, just for a week until something could be arranged. Jonas had said nothing at first, just looked out the window for a long time. Then he nodded. When Clara stepped over the threshold, dirt on her boots, hair in tangled braids, she stopped and stared at the cradle. Meline offered her tea. Jonas, standing behind the stove, allowed the faintest smile to form beneath his beard. No one mentioned the past. No one had to. In that cabin, peace didn't announce itself. It just arrived, like spring thaw, like seeds waking up beneath the soil, quiet and sure. Hope didn't shout, it grew. The cradle rocked gently beside the hearth, the soft creak of wood barely rising above the pop and hiss of the fire. A quilt pieced from old fabric, one square taken from Malin's first shawl, another from the hem of Jonas's worn coat, was tucked around a sleeping baby. The child's tiny fingers curled and uncurled in dream, the quietest coo escaping her lips like a sigh from the soul. Malin stood nearby, her arms crossed gently over her stomach, head tilted as she watched the little chest rise and fall. It wasn't her child by blood, not Jonas's either, but the cradle, once a tomb of memory, now held a living, breathing symbol of everything they'd begun to build. A family not made of name or inheritance, but of choice, of survival, of healing. The baby's name was Anna, left by her mother at the preacher's doorstep, born of desperation and handed into the world with no roadmap. The town, once too proud to interfere, now moved differently. They'd asked Malin first, not because she was poor or burdened or owed something, but because she had a home where love didn't ask for blood to justify its place. Jonas had said little when they brought her. He'd taken one look at the baby's tiny face, the soft swell of her cheek, and nodded. The next morning, he sanded the cradle smooth, oiled the joints, and carved a new set of initials along the curve of the headboard. Small, careful letters, A.R. Malin didn't cry when she saw it, but that night she hummed a lullaby she hadn't sung since her own mother braided her hair, and Anna slept through the night. Now the cabin felt full, not crowded but warm. 2 bowls at the table became 3. One shawl by the door became a row of coats, small and large, hung neatly on carved pegs. The sound of silence had changed too. It no longer pressed like grief. It breathed. Outside, the creek ran fast and clean, washing the last of the winter frost down through the valley. Jonas sat at the old work table, back bent, brow furrowed as he wrote. Slowly, deliberately, each letter formed like a carving into bark. Dear Sister May, thank you, not just for what you said that day in the square, but for what you saw. You saw a man who hadn't spoken to God in years, a girl no one saw as free. You saw a life still worth mending. He paused, looking up through the window. Malin had stepped out into the yard, rocking Anna gently in her arms as she showed her the garden, pointing to the first green shoots pushing up through black soil. He dipped the pen again. I thought the world had taken everything, but it gave something back I never asked for. And now there's a cradle filled with life, not memory. He signed it, folded it neatly, and set it aside to be delivered next time the preacher passed through. In the cradle, Anna stirred and sighed, her tiny fingers brushing the edge of the quilt. Malin returned inside, kissed her forehead, and laid her gently back. The fire danced. The windows glowed. And in the heart of the wilderness, love lingered. Not loud, not fast, but certain. The sun was just cresting the ridge when Jonas Cutter saddled his mule and set off down the trail into Windmere. The forest was alive with morning, the chatter of birds, the distant snap of branches from a doe, and her fawn, the hush of wind through the high needles. He rode without hurry, his coat worn at the shoulders, a satchel slung across his back, filled with notes and folded lists written in Malin's careful hand. The path, once a line drawn between isolation and the rest of the world, no longer felt like a wall. It was simply a road. He didn't wear his rifle, just a walking stick strapped to the saddle and a hunting knife at his side, more out of habit than worry. This ride wasn't about defense. It was about gathering, lumber for a second bed frame, cloth for new dresses, school books for Clara and Anna when they grew. The list was long and full of small things, the kind of things people only buy when they plan to stay. Windmere came into view slowly, the rooftops rising like teeth from the earth, the smoke from chimneys curling into the soft blue of late spring. Jonas rode into town not with thunder, but with the quiet presence of someone who belonged, not in the center, but not outside it anymore either. The blacksmith looked up from his anvil and gave a nod. The baker's boy, covered in flour to his elbows, grinned and waved. 2 girls ran past him, skipping rope, calling out, "Hello, Mr. Cutter," with the breathless boldness only children have. Even the preacher, standing on the chapel steps wiping his spectacles, tipped his hat as Jonas passed. "Morning, Jonas." Jonas raised a hand in return. No words, but his eyes softened, and the corner of his mouth tugged upward. He went about his business slow and steady, selecting boards from the mill yard inspecting bolts of cloth at the general store, while the owner, Mrs. Callum, watched him with something close to motherly pride. When he asked if the new primers had arrived, she smiled wide. "For the little one?" she asked. Jonas nodded. "I'll throw in a slate and chalk. Every girl should know her letters." By midday, his saddlebags were full. He stopped once more at the edge of town to eat a small lunch under the elm tree near the schoolhouse. A few children stared at him, whispered, then went back to their games. He didn't mind. The whispers didn't feel like fear anymore, just wonder. He left before the sun began its descent, heading back up the trail with the rhythm of a man at peace. As the trees closed around him once more, and the sound of town faded behind him, he exhaled, slow and even, the kind of breath a man takes when a long wait has been set down. At the cabin, Milan stood on the porch, a pot of tea already steeping beside her. She smiled when she saw him, her hands resting over her apron. Anna gurgled in the cradle nearby, kicking her feet. Clara peeked from the window, eyes bright. Jonas swung down from the saddle, handed over the satchel of cloth and books, and sat on the stoop beside Milan. She poured him tea without asking. He took a sip, looked out across the clearing to where the garden had begun to sprout again. And then, quietly, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not loud, not long, but real. The kind of laugh that returns to a man not because he's forgotten sorrow, but because he's finally survived it. They say she was once sold like cattle, her name written in ledgers and her worth measured in dollars in silence. They say she stood on a platform with rope-burned wrists and a bruise on her cheek, and not a soul moved to stop it, until one man did. And they say he once lived only with ghosts, that the fire took more than his home, that his heart burned down with it, that he vanished into the pines not to survive, but to disappear. But stories are strange things. They grow, they root, and sometimes they bloom. In Windermere, folks speak softer now when they mention Jonas Cutter. They speak with a different tone than they used to, less fear, more reverence. He's not a myth anymore. Not quite. Just a man who found something to protect again, and in doing so, found his way back from the edge. They say he carried her up the mountain like she was made of glass, and that for weeks no one dared follow. But when the truth came down, when that burned letter was read and the lie unwrapped in full daylight, it was Milan's voice that cracked the silence. It was her strength that turned the tide. Not because she fought, but because she stood. And when the trials passed, and the men who had traded in shadows were sent away or set to labor under the same sun they once used to oppress, the town changed. The saloon opened its back room to mothers in need. The church posted notices in 2 languages. A garden grew outside the schoolhouse. But the cabin in the pines remained apart, nestled in the quiet fold of the mountain, where the creek ran strong and the trees swayed like guardians in the wind. No one visited often, but those who did said the place felt different now. Lighter. There were toys carved from maple scattered across the porch, little birds and bears, and even a tiny fiddle that made no music but looked like it could. There were wildflowers planted in clean rows, and a swing hanging from a branch strong enough to hold more than just a child. They say Malin still paints, mostly birds, some faces, and that her laughter can be heard from the creek when the children splash in summer. They say Clara reads aloud in the evenings and that Jonas listens with his eyes closed, rocking slowly in his chair. Sometimes a traveler passing through will ask where to find the man who once stopped an auction with only his voice and a blade. The townsfolk will point to the trail and say, "Follow the sound of the wind. If you hear it right, it'll lead you to where he stepped in." And they'll lower their voices just a little, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because in that valley, when the pines rustle and the smoke from the chimney curls skyward, the story is still alive. Not just as memory, not just as warning, but as proof. that a man can be broken and still choose to stand, that a girl can be discarded and still rise, and that together they built something no evil could touch, a home, a refuge, a beginning. And the wind, they say, still carries the whisper. That's where the mountain man stepped in.